like to talk about a pretty challenging topic, honestly, and this is something that needs to be discussed and frankly isn't discussed often enough. But when we think about the built environment, there's been a long-running history of racial impacts in the built environment, and um, everybody always hasn't had a seat at the table. Everyone's outcomes aren't necessarily determined by merit or other um, equal and equitable choices and metrics. And I think if you're in the built environment business, um, you would do yourself a great favor if you read this book. It's called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And Richard goes through in substantial detail kind of the history of how government segregation practices were used to separate people in the built environment in cities, and it's all over the country. It's not just, I'm in the American South. It's not just in these parts. It's kind of everywhere, and it goes through the long history of practices that were put in place and practices that still, frankly, happen more than you'd think, and the practices that also were made illegal years ago in the 60s, but have long-lasting and generational impacts on people in our communities and the built environment as well. So it's a gut-wrenching book, and it's a tough read, but it is I think one of the most important topics that if you're in this business you can learn about if you don't already know. And then the second book here is pretty specific to me and my circumstance, but that's the book called It's Historic Black Neighborhoods of Raleigh, written by Carmen Cauthen. And Carmen is a local historian here in Raleigh, and she has written this book released a few years ago, and she went through kind of neighborhood by neighborhood and street by street and talks about, specific to Raleigh, but the black neighborhoods that exist today and that used to exist here in Raleigh. And again, I think when paired with The Color of Law for local Raleigh residents and frankly anybody who's interested in the history of Raleigh, I think it gives a great insight and connects a lot of the dots of the history and the people and the places and spaces of Raleigh. And it's a story, again, that's not often told and not often shared, but is critical to our history. And if you're in Raleigh, it just does such a great job of showing you places all over town that maybe you've heard about and names you're familiar with, but it really dives into the history of those people and those neighborhoods. So kind of a double whammy, two book recommendations this time, but Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And if you're in Raleigh or frankly North Carolina or anywhere, Historic Neighborhoods of Raleigh by Carmen Cauthen. And if you're not in Raleigh, I would do some searching and find out if you've got a local historian who has taken the time and effort to put together a similar book, because again, the story played out across the United States, and I think it's important for you to know your town's history and some of the impacts of people and places and choices that aren't often discussed. So it's definitely something to look into if you've got the option.